For many people, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most well-known tales in the Bible, often cited as an example of divine punishment for sexual immorality, especially homosexuality. Over the centuries, this narrative has been simplified and passed down in a way that makes it seem like the cities were destroyed solely because of sexual sin. This version, while popular, is deeply misleading and fails to reflect the complexity of the original biblical account. In reality, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has far more layers than many people realize. What most of us have heard is not the full story, it's a version shaped by tradition, interpretation, and selective emphasis. Religious teachings, particularly in Christianity, have historically focused on the sexual elements of the story, often using it as a warning against non-traditional sexual behavior. But if we look closer at the text, especially in Genesis chapters 18 and 19, we find that the Bible never clearly states that homosexuality was the main reason for the city's destruction. This interpretation is largely a result of centuries of cultural bias and the tendency to focus on surface-level actions instead of the deeper moral and social issues at play. The truth is, the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah go beyond any one act. They represent the total breakdown of a society's values, especially its failure to uphold justice, compassion, and hospitality. These were essential moral standards in ancient times. The people of Sodom were not condemned for a single behavior, but for a way of life that ignored the needs of the vulnerable, rejected strangers, and embraced cruelty and selfishness. The attempt by the townsmen to harm the angelic visitors, for example, is less about sexuality and more about violence, abuse of power, and the refusal to honor one of the most sacred duties of ancient culture, protecting guests and outsiders. So, when we reduce the story to only a sexual sin, we strip it of its deeper message. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just a tale of punishment, it's a powerful reflection on what happens when a society abandons its core values. Understanding this helps us see the story not as a tool for judgment, but as a mirror meant to challenge how we treat others, especially the marginalized. It reminds us that the real downfall of a society isn't one kind of sin, it's the loss of empathy, justice, and humanity. To truly understand the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's essential to look beyond the moral judgments and examine the historical and geographical context in which these cities existed. These weren't just random towns mentioned in the Bible, they were real places located in a strategically important region in the ancient world. Most scholars believe Sodom and Gomorrah were situated in the southeastern part of Canaan, near what is now the Dead Sea, an area known today for its barren, lifeless landscape. But back then, it was very different. In ancient times, this region played a critical role in trade, lying on a key commercial route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. This prime location gave the city significant economic power. The land was fertile, rich in natural resources, and supported thriving agriculture and livestock. Sodom and Gomorrah were prosperous, wealthy, and influential symbols of success and development. But beneath the surface, their society was deeply broken. Despite their material wealth, these cities lacked the moral and ethical structures needed to sustain a healthy community. Justice, compassion, and hospitality values that were fundamental to ancient societies had eroded. In those times, hospitality wasn't just about being polite. It was a moral duty. Welcoming travelers, protecting the vulnerable, and offering support to outsiders were essential parts of what it meant to be a good and honorable society. In Sodom and Gomorrah, those values had all but disappeared. The Bible portrays the people of these cities as living lives of excess, not just in pleasure or indulgence, but in their disregard for the weak and marginalized. Violence, cruelty, and a lack of solidarity had taken over. The problem wasn't just individual behavior, it was a collective failure of society. When a culture values wealth and comfort above justice and kindness, it starts to unravel from within. That's what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. Understanding the prosperity of these cities makes their fall even more striking. They weren't punished because they were poor or struggling, they fell at the height of their success. This contrast sends a powerful message. A society can look strong on the outside, But if it loses its moral center, it's already on the path to collapse. The downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah is as much a warning about social decay as it is about divine judgment. It shows us that no amount of prosperity can make up for the absence of humanity, compassion, and justice at the heart of a community. When people think of Sodom and Gomorrah, the first thing that usually comes to mind is the idea of sexual sin, specifically homosexuality. This has become the dominant interpretation passed down through centuries of religious teachings. But the reality is much more complex. A closer look at the biblical texts, especially Genesis chapters 18 and 19, reveals that the true sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were far broader and deeper than just sexual immorality. Reducing their downfall to one act or orientation misses the larger picture of a society that was spiritually and morally bankrupt. In fact, the Bible never directly states that homosexuality was the reason for the city's destruction. Instead, it highlights a range of social and moral failures. In Genesis 18:20-21, God says, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous." This outcry wasn't just about sexual misconduct. It was the collective cry of the oppressed, the poor, the strangers who were mistreated and ignored. The true sin of these cities was their lack of justice, compassion, and hospitality, core values in ancient Middle Eastern culture. One of the most telling moments comes in Genesis 19, when two angels arrive in Sodom disguised as travelers. Lot welcomes them into his home, offering food and protection, something expected in that time. But the men of the city surround Lot's house and demand to abuse the visitors. This disturbing scene is often misinterpreted as a condemnation of homosexuality, but in truth, it's about violence, domination, and the total breakdown of basic human decency. The crowd's actions represent a society that had lost all sense of respect for others, especially outsiders. Hospitality wasn't just a social custom, it was a sacred obligation. To violate it, especially with such aggression, was seen as a severe moral failure. The way Sodom's people treated foreigners was a clear sign that the community had become corrupt at its core. In Ezekiel 16:49, the prophet makes this point even clearer. "Now, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy." So when we look at the full context, it becomes clear that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was about systemic injustice, not simply individual sin. It was about a society that had stopped caring for others and instead turned inward, embracing selfishness, cruelty, and the abuse of power. That, according to the Bible, was their real downfall. To fully grasp the moral message behind the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we have to take a closer look at the role of Lot. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, is portrayed as a righteous man living in the middle of a corrupt and decaying society. His actions throughout the story serve as a striking contrast to the behavior of the people around him. While the rest of the city was lost in cruelty, violence, and selfishness, Lot stood out as someone who still honored the ancient values of hospitality and moral responsibility. When the two angels, disguised as travelers, arrive in Sodom, Lot doesn't hesitate. He invites them into his home, offers them food, shelter, and safety. In ancient times, this act wasn't just kindness. It was a sacred duty. Protecting guests, especially strangers, was one of the highest moral obligations. Lot understood that. And when the men of the city surrounded his house and demanded to harm the visitors, Lot did something shocking and desperate. He offered his own daughters in an attempt to protect his guests. To modern readers, this act is deeply disturbing. How could a father make such an offer? But to understand this moment, we have to see it through the cultural lens of the time. Lot wasn't devaluing his daughters. He was trying, in a moment of extreme crisis, to uphold the sacred code of hospitality, something the rest of the city had completely abandoned. His action was not perfect, and it reflects the complexity of trying to do the right thing in a morally broken world. Lot's behavior highlights the depth of corruption in Sodom. He was the only one willing to resist the mob, the only one trying to protect what was right. That kind of moral resistance, standing alone for what's right when everyone else chooses wrong, is one of the most powerful parts of the story. It shows how far a society can fall when a single good man seems like an outsider. Later, when the angels tell Lot to flee the city with his family, it becomes clear that Lot's righteousness has given him a chance to escape the judgment coming to Sodom. His escape is more than just fizz, it's a symbol of spiritual preservation. Even in a place drowning in corruption, someone who holds on to basic values like hospitality, justice, and compassion can still be saved. Lot's role reminds us that moral courage matters, especially when the world around us is falling apart. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most dramatic and terrifying events in the Bible. Fire and sulfur rained down from the sky, wiping out the cities and everything in them. At first glance, it seems like a straightforward act of divine punishment, a harsh, immediate response to extreme sin. But when we look deeper, we begin to see that this destruction holds much more meaning than just vengeance. It's not simply about God being angry. It's a symbol of what happens when a society collapses under the weight of its own moral failures. Throughout the Bible, fire is often used as a metaphor for purification, not just destruction. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire can be seen as a way to cleanse a civilization that had become hopelessly corrupt. The cities weren't destroyed because of one bad night or one sinful act. They had reached a point of no return. Justice, compassion, and human decency were no longer part of daily life. When a society abandons its core values, it begins to rot from within. In that sense, the destruction was not just punishment. It was the natural outcome of a system that could no longer sustain itself. Some modern scholars even suggest that the event may have a natural explanation, like a volcanic eruption or a meteor strike near the Dead Sea. While that theory doesn't take away from the spiritual weight of the story, it adds another layer, that nature itself responded to the chaos of human corruption. Whether divine or natural, the message remains the same: no society can survive when it turns its back on justice, hospitality, and the vulnerable. What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah is a warning, not just to individuals, but to whole civilizations. It tells us that social decay doesn't always start with violence or open injustice. It often begins quietly, when people stop caring about each other, when selfishness becomes the norm, and when the strong stop protecting the weak. When those things become acceptable, collapse is not far behind. So the fire and sulfur raining down are more than just special effects in a biblical story. They represent the total breakdown of a community's soul, and once that happens, rebuilding becomes impossible. The lesson here is not just about fear, it's about responsibility. It's a call to protect the values that keep a society healthy, fair, and humane before it's too late. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just a tale from ancient times, it speaks directly to the world we live in today. While the dramatic destruction of the cities grabs our attention, the deeper message is far more relevant. Societies fall not simply because of individual sins, but because of collective failures to uphold justice, compassion, and human dignity. The downfall of Sodom wasn't about one group of people or one specific act. It was about a culture that became indifferent to the suffering of others, a society that let selfishness and cruelty replace empathy and moral responsibility. This ancient story challenges us to take a hard look at our own communities. Are we truly caring for the poor, the vulnerable, the outsiders among us? Or have we, like Sodom, become so focused on comfort, power, and personal success that we've forgotten what it means to take care of one another? In many ways, the problems that led to Sodom's collapse are still with us today: rising inequality, social division, injustice, and a growing lack of empathy. It's easy to look at the past and judge. It's much harder to look around and ask, are we repeating the same mistakes? That's what this story asks of us. Not just to fear destruction, but to reflect deeply on the kind of society we are building. Are we protecting the vulnerable, welcoming the stranger, speaking up for justice? Or are we turning a blind eye, staying silent in the face of wrong, and allowing systems of oppression to grow stronger? Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a mirror, a way to examine how far we've come and how far we still have to go. The story doesn't just warn us about divine punishment. It reminds us that when a society stops prioritizing human dignity and solidarity, its collapse becomes inevitable from the inside out. The fire may not fall from the sky, but the damage is just as real when we allow injustice to become normal. But the message isn't all doom and gloom. There is hope. Just as Lot stood up for what was right, even when no one else did, we too can choose to live differently. Every act of kindness, every voice raised for justice, every choice to care about others helps push back against the decay. The lesson of Sodom is clear. We all play a part in shaping the moral direction of our world, and that starts with how we treat each other every single day. While the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is often remembered for its destruction, it also carries a powerful message of hope and redemption. In the middle of a collapsing society, one man, Lot, chose to live differently. He protected the vulnerable, upheld sacred values, and listened when it was time to walk away from what was broken. His story reminds us that even when everything around us seems dark, there is still the possibility of change. We are not powerless. Even in the worst circumstances, individual choices still matter. Lot's escape wasn't just about avoiding physical destruction. It symbolized something deeper, the chance to break free from a corrupt system and start fresh. His journey shows us that transformation begins with the courage to act, to protect what is right, and to let go of what no longer serves humanity. His wife, on the other hand, became a symbol of the danger of looking back, of holding on to values and ways of life that lead to destruction. The contrast between them reminds us that the path to hope often requires painful, but necessary, change. This message is just as relevant today. We may not live in ancient cities, but we do face many of the same moral challenges. Social injustice, indifference to the poor, discrimination, and the neglect of basic human dignity still plague our modern world. The question is not whether these problems exist, they do. The real question is, what are we doing about them? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah invites each of us to take responsibility, not just as individuals, but as a community. Every time we defend someone who's vulnerable, stand up for what's right, or show compassion in a moment when it's easier to stay silent, we push back against the same forces that brought those ancient cities down. And just like Lot, we may not change the entire world, but we can preserve something good in the middle of the chaos. That matters. The ultimate lesson is clear. Societies don't fall overnight. They collapse when people stop caring. But they can also be rebuilt when people start choosing empathy, justice, and kindness again. In our own lives, we have the chance to write a different ending. We can learn from Sodom not by fearing fire from heaven, but by recognizing that every act of compassion is a spark that keeps hope alive. The story doesn't have to end in ruin. With courage, humility, and love, we can choose a better way forward.